Afternoon, everybody. My name is Philip McGuin. I'm the head of insights and consultancy for Stickyeyes. I'm going to show you a picture which I think many of you potentially could relate to. Social media is often, in my view, being coined like a Rubik's Cube. No matter how many times you try to do it, you simply can't figure it out. And what you end up often doing is putting in a solution that in many respects is simply not good enough. So what I'm going to do today is present to you a 7-step transformation framework. This framework essentially has a range of objectives, and the objectives behind this is to ensure that social media deployment is above all practical, that you can actually create a strategy that is actually relevant to the business and is actually relevant to the business also from an operational perspective. The other objective of the framework is to give you some understanding of the techniques and the processes for actually developing an engagement methodology. And the final objective, and a lot of this has been already discussed today, is to give you a simple yet effective understanding of the process of measurement and above all reporting. So, step 1. Location, motivation and participation. This is a very simple yet highly effective step. And what this involves is taking your customer data and essentially understanding how that customer behaves online. So what key questions does it address? Firstly, where are they actually engaged online? And this is quite an important area because what this allows you to do is actually to set social media into context. We're all here to discuss social media, but one of the things that you need to consider is the relevance of social media to your overall marketing strategy. It also allows you to look at the following key question. Where actually are your customers located? By profiling your customers and understanding how they behave online, you get some understanding of where they're actually located in terms of activity. So, are your customers have a greater propensity to potentially go on to Facebook vis-a-vis Twitter, vis-a-vis LinkedIn? Also, what is key to this step is actually understanding how that customer actually engages with brands online on a particular platform. So you could take something like age as a key variable in your data profiling and understand, does age actually influence whether or not somebody is willing to actually engage on Twitter vis-a-vis Facebook? Also, one of the key things that we need to consider is how do individuals want the brand to speak back to them? So step 2, observe, listen and discover. So what key questions does this ask? Firstly, you're taking industry benchmarking to effectively understand the shape of your market. So fundamentally, whether you're actually in financial services and you're selling to a consumer or you're within financial services and selling to other businesses, it's important to get a footprint within the market. And this footprint is essentially, where is the emphasis? So for example, for work that we've done for a recent insurance company, one of the discoveries that occurred to us was they were focused on looking at Twitter as a key engagement area, where actually the market was much more focused within LinkedIn. Also, what this allows you to do is to actually compare yourself with the competitors to understand your relative strengths and weaknesses. These strengths and weaknesses will give you some understanding as to actually which platforms are you genuinely doing well on and which platforms do you actually need to focus and eventually fix. Also, what can we learn from the competition? What can we learn from the market? It's ultimately understanding the market around you, how your competitors are leveraging certain techniques, what they're doing in terms of engagement on certain platforms, and actually looking at them and seeing, can we actually use something that they're doing? So, the process of competitor benchmarking, how does this work? Firstly, the consumer profiling step gives you some indication as to potentially where your customers are located in terms of platform and activity. You will obviously make a very simple deduction and say, actually, we're going to select 4 or 5 platforms. So you shortlist those platforms. You shortlist your competitors. It's also important to factor here is that you may be a brand that sells multiple products into the market to very different types of people, and ultimately you probably have very different types of competitors. You've got to define your metrics. You've got to define your methodology. I've worked in insights and data for many, many years now, and I go on a very basic, simple mantra. Keep your data simple. Keep your data and your methodology in an environment where you can actually sell it to other people within the business. Because ultimately, business buy-in will only come about if they actually understand what you're measuring and what you're doing. In terms of methodology itself, one of the techniques we tend to employ is actually very simple scorecarding mechanisms. A ranking system that gives or assigns a point depending upon the quality and the performance of that competitor. And what this allows you to do is to normalize the environment, to actually see exactly how you actually compare and contrast to a particular brand within the market. The next part of benchmarking is actually analysing volume and engagement. So volume very simply means the number of touch points within the market with a potential customer. Very simply, how many followers do you have on a LinkedIn company profile? Vis-a-vis engagement. So this is really sort of looking at replies, comments, shares, etc. And one of the key areas of the benchmarking is actually looking at content, tactics and activities. So this is understanding exactly what your competitors are doing in terms of the deployment of content. So is your competitor focused mainly around, say, price promotions, service updates? They're mainly focused around customer service. And when I mean tactics, in many respects, this is essentially the format of the content. So is your market have a greater propensity to actually engage in video content vis-a-vis thought leadership content? Okay, step 3. Select, prioritize and fix. So what key questions does this answer? Your consumer profiling, your competitor benchmarking will give you some indication as to where your market is actually leaning and what they're actually using. So what this part of the process does, it's saying to you, what do we actually need to focus on? That's going to be the key thing. And in the beginning I said this is about being practical and realistic. All businesses have limited time, limited resources, limited capability, and often limited experience. What this is designed to do is to actually focus your attention on what actually needs to be addressed. One of the things I will say about prioritization is this. You may be on 5 platforms, but actually only one you do well and another is relevant. The rest of them are not you shouldn't actually be engaged on. So in terms of prioritization, think about the word deprioritization as well. What shouldn't we actually focus on? Also, what tactics do we need to focus on? And what I mean by this is looking at the tactics of engagement, the tactics of content deployment, looking at what you're good at, what you've got in situ and actually what you need to bring on board. Again, this will be an issue of prioritization. It may be the case that you're people within your team that have that capability, but also they may not. And above all, as part of this fixing process, how can we actually leverage best practice within the market? So, those are the questions, but actually what do we look for? That's the key question. So, when I'm ever conducting a benchmarking best practice exercise, these are essentially the key areas that I look for. So I look for brands and competitors who are actually using social media across discipline. So a very simple example, how is a brand using, say, Twitter to help support an event activity? Looking in the market in terms of who's doing that really well. Looking at brands that are actually communicating that social between social platforms. So in terms of lead generation, they may be using LinkedIn to actually generate leads to a particular event, but that may actually be then supported by Twitter as well in terms of activity. Also to look at brands that are noted to be best practice on a very specific platform. So looking at the holistic approach to that particular piece of social platform. And as we go down, we can actually then start to look at a brand and look at the features on the platform. Often what you struggle with this area is finding brands that do everything well. That doesn't exist. Lots of brands do certain things very well. They also do things not so well. So the final one is looking at tactics in terms of the content that is deployed upon these platforms. What are brands doing? What kind of content? How are they actually using that content? This is one area, obviously, I cannot present on without actually touching on, and this is localization. It's a difficult question to answer, particularly because from our experience with deploying very practical social media strategies, we're often very mindful that most businesses don't necessarily have the capability and the resource to go global, particularly with your additional team that might actually be relatively underfunded and relatively underskilled in terms of the resources within that department. So before you answer the question of localization, you need to understand the level of maturity within your own business. Do you feel you've got the capability to actually localize your assets? And that should essentially be based upon, well, are we currently getting it right anyway? If we are, yes, we will have the capability. Don't ignore the logistics of developing and managing multiple platforms. When I ever do any benchmarking or research, I see a graveyard of LinkedIn groups, a graveyard of unused Twitter profiles. And also don't dismiss the advantages of economies of scale. So, step 4, grow, scale, and integrate. So what are the key questions? The previous steps have shown us actually what we should be doing and where we should be focused. What this looks at is how do we actually take those individual platforms and actually how do we actually grow our base, grow the audience? How do we develop it moving forward? A great example, again, I'll go back to the insurance company we've been working with. We articulated a policy, a strategy around LinkedIn, and a key part of that was actually LinkedIn groups. This was going to be a key area where they can actually start to engage with their market. We recommended participating in groups, but we also recommended actually creating their own group. The challenge is they don't really have the money, the time, and the resource to actually grow that group. So they have to think laterally about it. They simply acquired a group. And overnight, they increased from 0 to 35,000 followers as a group, a ready-made group that is actually well managed and actually knows what it's doing. Instant visibility to the target market. How do we ensure that the infrastructure is scalable? And what do I mean by this? As you're progressing and developing your strategy, you may want to, again, address the issue of localization, or you may want to address the issue of creating aspects of your social strategy that are very targeted and relevant to a particular target audience. Again, I will address LinkedIn as a good example of this. LinkedIn is very flexible in terms of allowing you to target very specific groups, but also create your own groups that are relevant to a particular type of business or a particular type of product. It's very scalable, in other words. And also, how do we actually integrate our social media into our existing activity? So, what's the process for doing this? Essentially, or in reality, these two elements are actually fused together, but I've separated them apart largely for simplicity. So when we're ever advising a client in terms of actually ensuring they grow their platforms and get also cross-channel benefit, we tend to recommend this. So look to actually grow the individual platforms themselves. Dedicated marketing campaign that is geared towards driving traffic to a particular network. So it may be the case we're interested in actually increasing the volume within our Twitter profile. We're actually interested in actually increasing the coverage on a particular group that we own. And then cross-campaign activity. What this essentially means is you've got your raft of pre-existing activity that you're doing. Is to look back and say, okay, based upon the research that we've done, based upon the best practice that we've done, are we actually deploying social media correctly? So again, I'll come back to the issue of the activity of events. It's a great one to actually start with because it's very powerful in terms of how social media can actually add value. And also, one of the areas that I will touch on is also biddable media. Most of these platforms come with some form of advertising now, and it's a very quick, effective way of actually driving traffic and actually building the audience on your platform. Step 5, create, engage, and inspire. So what key questions does this ask? This, for me, we talk about social media, we talk about engagement, we talk about great content, etc., etc. Actually, what it boils down to, do you actually have the skills to do it? Do you actually have the resource to do it? It's a very difficult thing to do. There are many, many techniques that you can employ, but ultimately it's about ensuring that you actually have the right staff in place to actually create the right quality of content. How do we ensure that engagement becomes part of the day-to-day activity? Too often I see social media being used on a ad hoc, sporadic basis. There's an attempt to do it and then it fades out. And ultimately, when you've answered the two questions above, how do you actually create great, compelling content? So the step process behind this is as follows. Firstly, look at your teams, look at your skills, look at your resources. What do you have and what don't you have? Are these specialist skills that you require? If they're not in your team, then you need to look at outsourcing. You want to start to establish content development as part of your operational functional framework of what you do in your teams on a day-to-day basis. Create a content schedule, an editorial schedule that gives you that visibility. You need publishing workflows, so you need a time frame, you need sign-off processes, you need a physical set of structures within your department that ensures that there's a level of continuity with the creation of the content and the output of the content. And finally, you need to get some understanding of the engagement tactics to use in terms of getting some sort of discussion around your content. So these may be very simple things in terms of the content format, sharing triggers, It could be the kind of questions that you're asking. And questions can be very powerful. So there can be open questions, closed questions. This may be a question that is provocative, designed to stimulate a debate. Step 6. This has been touched on heavily. And ultimately, it's about learn, educate, and cultivate. I'm a firm believer that social media starts at home, within your business, within your marketing team. It is these people who are actually going to take the lead and actually show everybody else within your business how it works. And if your marketing team are doing it very well, the business will gain confidence. Ultimately, it's about ensuring that social media is part of your operational DNA. So you're providing training, providing policies, providing guidelines, all very basic standard stuff that people are aware that you've got them and know can access them and can actually get some understanding of actually how to use social media. And ultimately, how do we stay ahead of the curve? The beginning piece talked about best of breed, benchmarking. This is not a one-off process. It's a process that you can keep going through. And as you actually start to improve what you're doing, you are constantly keeping the loop with actually who's doing what, how good are they, which influencers do I need to focus on. And the final step is track, measure, and report. Ultimately, it's going to answer these following questions. What tools do I need? In my view, really, essentially you only need 2 tools. You need a social monitoring tool and you need an analytics tool. At the very minimum. And for most people within this room, that actually would be more than enough. What question does it answer in terms of performance? Is social media actually delivering value? Is it actually giving you what you want? And ultimately, we hear this a lot. The business made a decision to invest in social media. Ultimately, is it aligned with their objectives? So these may be financial objectives, but there may be brand objectives as well. So very simply, this is how I see the reporting. Broken into 4 key areas. You need to report on market reach. So that's essentially the potential eyeballs within the market. A very simple example is like your Twitter followers. That will give you a good indication of reach within the market. The discussion, what's actually being spoken about? What's the volume of discussion? What's the volume of brand discussion? And then look at what's being discussed and essentially look at engagement. So piece of content's been published, it's had X reach, it's been discussed so many times and it's had this level of engagement. In other words, it's been shared, it's been retweeted, it's been commented about. Finally, acquisition. And I've kept acquisition quite broad here. So this can be, you can measure traffic acquisition, you can actually measure social media from a lead acquisition and also from a monetary acquisition as well. And anybody who's using an analytics package these days, whether it's Google Analytics, you can tie back content deployed on Facebook right back to your website and drive monetary value.